She was only 9 years old, walking alone on the cold streets at midnight, her tiny hands gripping an old, faded photograph. She had lost everything: her parents, her home, and even hope itself. And then she saw him, Bryan Cranston, her last chance at holding on to a piece of her past. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. This is the story of Emma, a little girl who defied the odds and took a risk that would change her life forever. She didn't just want to meet a celebrity, she needed to. Because to her, Bryan Cranston wasn't just an actor, he was the last connection to the only happiness she had ever known. But fate had different plans that night, leading to a shocking series of events that no one could have foreseen. Emma was only 9 years old, but the weight she carried was far too heavy for her small shoulders. Most kids her age worried about scraped knees, forgotten homework, or bedtime arguments. But Emma, she worried about something far deeper, something no child should ever have to face. 2 years ago, her life had been nothing short of perfect. She had a loving family, a warm home, and a childhood wrapped in laughter and security. Every single day, her parents found small ways to make life feel magical. Whether it was an impromptu pillow fight in the living room, a weekend picnic at the park, or her father lifting her onto his shoulders so she could touch the leaves on the tallest trees, Emma had known nothing but love. Her family thrived on rituals, simple, comforting traditions that made their house feel like home. Sunday mornings meant pancakes, fluffy, golden, dripping with syrup, always made together in their tiny kitchen. Bedtime stories were a sacred routine, with her mother's gentle voice guiding her into a world of dreams. But her favorite ritual? Movie nights. Every Friday, like clockwork, the three of them would gather on the couch, snuggled under the same old blanket. Her dad would grab the remote, and without fail, a Bryan Cranston movie would flicker onto the screen. Her father used to grin and say, "Now that's a guy you'd want as your TV, Dad." Her mother would roll her eyes playfully. Yeah, if he wasn't always playing such serious characters. Emma didn't fully understand the joke, but she didn't need to. She just loved those nights, loved being tucked between them, safe and warm, feeling like nothing bad could ever touch them. She believed that those moments would last forever, but forever didn't last long enough. It had been an ordinary evening, a car ride home, her parents chatting in the front seat, Emma humming quietly in the back. She had asked if they could stop for ice cream, and her father had laughed, promising that next time they would. And then, red lights, screeching tires, a sharp gasp from her mother, and then, nothing. When Emma woke up, the world had changed. The sterile white walls of a hospital surrounded her. Beeping machines hummed in the background. She had felt a dull ache in her head, but nothing hurt as much as the emptiness in the room. Her parents weren't there. At first, she thought they were in another room. Maybe they were getting checked by doctors too. Maybe they were asleep, just like she had been. But then a nurse walked in, her expression soft, too soft. That was when Emma knew. The truth hit her like a tidal wave, stealing the breath from her lungs. She wasn't going home. She would never hear her mother's laughter again. Never feel her father ruffle her hair playfully. Never have another movie night under that warm old blanket. Her parents were gone, forever. And suddenly, nothing felt real anymore. The hospital bed turned into a foster home, and then another, and another. Every time she moved, it felt like she was leaving another piece of herself behind. The walls around her changed, the voices changed, but the emptiness never did. People tried to be kind. The caregivers smiled warmly. The other kids in the home played nearby, but none of it filled the void inside her. She felt like a shadow of the girl she used to be, wandering through a world that had long since moved on without her. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, desperate to hold on to the past. She would close her eyes and try to remember the sound of her father's voice, the way her mother smelled when she hugged her. But memory was cruel. The more she reached for them, the more they faded, and that terrified her. The only thing that kept them alive? Bryan Cranston's movies. It started as a way to escape. Late at night, when everyone else was asleep, she would sneak into the common room of the foster home and turn on one of his films. The flickering screen became her safe place, a portal back to the life she had lost. For those 2 hours, she wasn't just Emma, the orphan. She was Emma, the girl who still had a home, a family, and a couch to curl up on. She would whisper along with the familiar lines, pretending that her parents were right there beside her, laughing at the same scenes, making the same jokes. But even that wasn't enough, because the truth was, Bryan Cranston wasn't just an actor to her. He was the last connection to the life she had lost. And then one day, hope arrived in the form of a whispered conversation. Emma had been folding laundry with some of the caregivers when she overheard them talking in hushed voices. "Did you hear? Bryan Cranston is coming to town for an event this weekend." The words slammed into her like a lightning bolt. Bryan Cranston, here, in her city. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they might hear it. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the sleeve of a folded sweater. This was it, a chance to see him. Even if it was only from a distance, even if it was just for a moment, maybe, just maybe, it would bring her closer to her parents again. She had to go. She needed to go, but then the next sentence shattered her world. "The kids aren't allowed to go." It felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Her hands curled into fists. Her throat tightened. She had never asked for anything before. Not once, not when she had to switch foster homes. Not when she had to leave behind the few friends she made. Not when she cried herself to sleep every night, wishing for things to be different. But this was different, and this was the only thing she had left. The final plea. He rushed to find Mrs. Thompson, the head of the foster homes. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Please, just this once. I need this. I promise I won't ask for anything else." Mrs. Thompson sighed, her face heavy with sympathy. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. We can't." Emma's stomach dropped. Just like that, the last flicker of hope was snuffed out. She barely felt the weight of her own body as she walked back to her room. The walls felt colder. The bed felt smaller. She curled into herself, staring at the ceiling, the same way she had for the past 2 years. Cold, empty, alone. And then, a thought crept into her mind. If no one was going to help her, she would do it alone. She wouldn't ask anymore. She wouldn't beg. She would find her own way. And no matter what it took, she was going to see Bryan Cranston, even if she had to walk there herself. Emma had never run away before. She wasn't the type of child to break rules, to sneak out after dark, or to push boundaries like some of the other kids at the foster home. She had always followed instructions, done what was expected of her, and never asked for more than she was given. But that night, everything was different. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small square window across the room. The glass was smudged, the moonlight barely filtering through the old curtains. A quiet heaviness pressed against her chest as she thought about what she was about to do. She had nothing to lose. No one was coming to take her hand and tell her everything would be okay. No one was going to bend the rules just this once, just for her. She was alone. With trembling fingers, she reached under her pillow and pulled out the few possessions that meant something to her. A worn-out photo of her parents, the edges curled from being held too many times. The ink faded but still clear enough to show their smiling faces. A water bottle, half full. A granola bar, the only snack she had managed to tuck away. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She wasn't planning on being gone forever. She just needed to get to the event. She just needed to see him, to prove to herself that the world wasn't as empty as it felt. Taking one last glance around the dull, lifeless foster home, she let out a shaky breath. "I have to do this," she whispered to herself. Then, as quietly as she could, she slipped out of bed, tiptoed to the window, and carefully lifted it open. The night air rushed in, cool against her skin, carrying the distant hum of the city beyond. Her heart pounded as she climbed onto the ledge, gripping the frame for balance. One wrong step, one loud noise, and she'd be caught. But she didn't hesitate. She took a deep breath and disappeared into the night. The city after dark wasn't what she had imagined. In movies, nighttime streets were alive with neon lights, bustling with people, music playing from distant shops. She had pictured something warm, something safe. But this was different. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven, littered with discarded newspapers that fluttered in the wind like forgotten memories. Streetlights flickered, some broken entirely, casting eerie shadows along the pavement. Every passing car made her flinch. Every distant voice made her heartbeat quicken. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack as she walked. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that the event was downtown. She had overheard the caregivers mentioning it while folding laundry, and downtown was far. Her legs ached after just an hour of walking, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She imagined her father beside her, holding her hand, telling her stories to keep her distracted. She imagined her mother smiling down at her, humming a soft tune. But when she looked around, she was still alone. The street stretched endlessly ahead of her, the cold seeping into her skin, exhaustion creeping into her bones. But she kept going, step after step, block after block, until she saw it, a massive venue glowing with lights, surrounded by people. Her exhaustion faded instantly. This was it. She had made it. Her heart pounded as she hurried forward, weaving through the crowd, gripping the metal security barrier in front of the entrance. Everything would be okay now, because in just a few minutes, Bryan Cranston would walk onto that stage, and for the first time in years, she would feel close to her parents again. She waited, breathless, eyes darting across this crowd, searching for any sign of him. And then, a man stepped onto the stage. Something was wrong. He wasn't smiling, his posture was tense. He cleared his throat, holding a microphone close to his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that Bryan Cranston will not be attending tonight." The words hit Emma like a brick wall. No, that wasn't right. She must have misheard. She turned to the people beside her, waiting for someone to correct him, to say this was just a mistake. But they were already turning away, sighing in disappointment. Some groaned, some grumbled about wasted time. Others just shrugged, moving on with their lives as if this didn't matter. But it mattered to her, more than anything. Her fingers tightened around the metal barrier. The weight in her chest grew heavier and heavier until it felt like she couldn't breathe. She had risked everything. She had walked alone through the city. She had defied every rule, every warning. And for what? For nothing? Her vision blurred as she backed away from the crowd, away from the stage, away from the one thing that had kept her going. She had never felt so lost. The world around her blurred into colors and noise, faces passing her without a second glance. She felt small, invisible. And then she saw him. At first, she thought she was imagining it. A man walking quickly, keeping his head down, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, trying not to be noticed. But she knew that face. Her heart jumped to her throat. It was him, Bryan Cranston, right there. Not on a stage, not behind a crowd of screaming fans, just walking like an ordinary person. Her feet moved before her brain could catch up. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She ran. "Bryan!" Her voice cracked, desperate, filled with all the emotions she had been holding back. He stopped, turned. Their eyes met. It was real. It was him. For the first time in years, hope flickered inside her. She had found him. She had done it. But she had no idea what would happen next. Bryan Cranston turned around, his brows furrowing slightly as he scanned the dimly lit street. At first, he wasn't sure what had caught his attention. The city was alive, as it always was. Cars rushing by in the distance, streetlights flickering overhead, pedestrians lost in their own worlds. But then his gaze landed on something out of place. A girl, a small, fragile-looking girl, standing alone on the sidewalk. She was breathing heavily, her tiny shoulders rising and falling as if she had run a great distance. Her clothes looked wrinkled, her shoes scuffed. Her hair was slightly tangled, and under the glow of the streetlight, he could see the dried streaks of tears on her face. But what struck him the most was the way she was looking at him. Like he was the last bit of hope she had left in the world. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she forced herself forward, inch by inch, as if sheer willpower was the only thing keeping her standing. And then, in a voice that barely carried over the noise of the city, she called out, "Bryan! Bryan Cranston!" Her voice was shaky, desperate, raw. Bryan instinctively glanced around, expecting security to step in, to block her path, to handle the situation like they always did when fans got too close. But no one came, because there was no security. He was alone. His plans for the night had been simple. Keep his head down, move through the city unnoticed. He wasn't supposed to be recognized. But now here was this girl standing in the middle of a nearly empty sidewalk, looking at him like he was the answer to a question she had been asking for a long, long time. Cautiously, Bryan took a step toward her, lowering his cap slightly. His expression softened as confusion turned into concern. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, his voice quieter now. "Are you okay?" The moment the words left his lips, he saw it, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She opened her mouth trying to speak, but nothing came out at first. Her throat was dry. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear anything else. And then, everything came rushing out. She told him everything, her parents, the accident, the foster home. She told him how his movies were the only thing that made her feel connected to them, how she had snuck out in the middle of the night, how she had walked for hours just to be here. She didn't even realize she was crying until she felt the warmth of her tears dripping onto her hands. Bryan didn't interrupt. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look around, waiting for someone to come take over the situation. He just stood there, listening. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, His eyes were filled with something she hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, not discomfort, just understanding. And when she finally finished, when her voice was barely more than a whisper, he let out a deep breath and knelt in front of her so they were eye level. "You're one tough kid, you know that?" he said, offering a small, gentle smile. Emma let out a shaky laugh, rubbing her eyes with the back of her sleeve. But, but I thought you weren't coming," she murmured. Bryan sighed, glancing around before adjusting his cap lower on his head. "Yeah, I was supposed to be at the event, but some things came up. I don't usually make public appearances like that," he admitted. "I was just passing through town, trying to keep a low profile." Emma nodded as if she understood, even though she didn't. What mattered was that he was here, and for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't alone. But then, something shifted. A wave of dizziness hit her. Her vision swam, the streetlights above her blurring into streaks of yellow and white. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was tilting, as if the whole world had suddenly become unsteady. Bryan's voice sounded distant, like it was coming from the other end of a tunnel. "Emma?" She barely heard him. Her legs buckled. Bryan lunged forward just in time, catching her before she hit the pavement. His heart pounded as he held her up, his voice sharp and urgent. Hey, kid, stay with me. What's wrong?" Emma's lips trembled, her breath shallow. I forgot. My medicine." Bryan's stomach dropped. "Medicine? What kind of medicine?" Her skin was pale now, her eyelids fluttering like she was fighting to stay awake. "Diabetes," she whispered, barely able to get the word out. Bryan swore under his breath, tightening his grip on her. This wasn't just exhaustion. This wasn't just hunger. This was serious, and he had no idea what to do. He had played roles where he had to act calm under pressure, where he had to think fast, but this wasn't a script. This was real, and he wasn't about to let this kid die in his arms. "Where's your insulin?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma weakly fumbled for her backpack, but she could barely lift her fingers. Bryan grabbed it himself, tearing it open. A water bottle, a granola bar, a faded photograph of her parents, but no insulin. Emma let out a weak, panicked breath. "I left it." Bryan's grip tightened around her. There was no time to think, no time to panic. He scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. Then he ran. "Call a hospital now!" he barked at his assistant, who was waiting by a parked car nearby. The assistant fumbled with their phone, hands shaking as they relayed the emergency. Bryan didn't wait. He threw open the car door, climbed into the back seat with Emma still in his arms, and shouted at the driver, "Get us to the nearest hospital, now!" The tires screeched against the pavement as they sped down the road. Emma's breathing was slowing. Bryan kept his eyes locked on her, gently shaking her every time her eyelids fluttered shut. "Stay with me, kid. Don't you dare fall asleep." She tried to smile, but it was weak. "I'm tired." "Nope," Bryan said, forcing a chuckle even as his throat tightened. "You don't get to be tired right now." She was so small, so fragile, and for the first time in his life, Bryan Cranston, who had played some of the toughest characters on screen, felt completely powerless. He just had to hope they got there in time. The car came to a screeching halt in front of the emergency room entrance, tires skidding against the pavement, the scent of burnt rubber filling the air. Bryan Cranston didn't wait for the car to come to a complete stop. He kicked the door open, gripping Emma tightly in his arms. She was far too still, her small frame barely moving, her breathing shallow. He could feel the heat radiating off her forehead, yet her fingers felt icy cold against his wrist. "Somebody help," he bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. "She's diabetic. She's going into shock." His voice cut through the hospital's usual late-night murmur, snapping doctors and nurses into motion. A stretcher appeared almost instantly, wheels screeching against the linoleum floor as hands reached out to take her from him. For the first time that night, Bryan was forced to let go of Emma, and it nearly broke him. She was whisked away so fast that he barely had time to process it. He wanted to say something, to tell her she would be okay, that he was still here. But before he could, she was gone. And just like that, the hospital doors swung shut. Bryan stood there, frozen, staring at the doors that had just swallowed her whole. His heart was still hammering in his chest, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body tense as if he were bracing for a fight. He had played heroes before, characters who always knew what to do, who always had the answers. But this wasn't a movie. This wasn't a script where he could flip ahead and read how it all turned out. This was real, and he was completely, terrifyingly powerless. A nurse tapped his shoulder gently. "Sir, do you need to sit down?" He barely heard her. His mind was racing, replaying every second of the night over and over again. If I had just stayed at the event like I was supposed to, if I had arrived a few minutes earlier, if I had asked her about her health sooner. He shook his head, exhaling sharply, forcing himself to push those thoughts away. None of that mattered now. All he could do was wait. Minutes stretched into hours. He paced the hospital hallway, running a hand through his hair, his fingers gripping the back of his neck as he stared down at the cold tile floor. At one point, he sat in a chair, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. The soft hum of a vending machine buzzed in the background, but he barely noticed it. Nothing mattered except that little girl behind those closed doors. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the doors finally opened. A doctor walked out, still wearing gloves, the expression on his face unreadable. Bryan's stomach twisted into knots. His throat felt too tight, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "Is she?" The doctor shook his head quickly. "She's stable." Bryan exhaled, his body sagging as relief crashed over him. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath. "She's awake?" His voice was quieter now, almost afraid to believe it. The doctor nodded. "She's weak, but she's alert. You can see her now." Bryan didn't waste a second. He pushed past the doctor, making his way down the hallway, his footsteps heavy against the floor. He stepped into the small hospital room, and there she was, Emma. Small, fragile, tired, but alive. She looked so tiny in the hospital bed, an IV taped to her arm, a heart monitor beeping steadily beside her. The fluorescent lights cast a soft glow over her pale face. When she turned her head and saw him, her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Bryan let out a breathy laugh, dragging a chair closer to her bed. "Of course, kid. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, they just sat there. No cameras, no scripts, no flashing lights, just two people who had somehow, against all odds, found each other. Then, after a moment, Emma's expression shifted. She bit her lip, looking down at the blanket covering her. I don't think I can go back," she said quietly. Bryan frowned. "Back? To the foster home?" Her voice wavered. "Nobody wants a kid like me." Bryan felt something tighten in his chest. "I heard Mrs. Thompson say that before, that families don't want to adopt kids with health problems. They don't want the responsibility." Bryan inhaled sharply. How could a 9-year-old talk like that? Like she had already accepted that the world had no place for her? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady. "You don't deserve to feel like that. None of this is your fault, and I'll make sure you never have to worry about it again." Emma blinked. "What do you mean?" Bryan smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, I'm going to take care of it." Within the next few days, Bryan Cranston made good on his word. He set up a fund in Emma's name, one that would cover all of her medical expenses for the rest of her life. Every insulin dose, every doctor's visit, every emergency. She would never have to worry about being too much for a family again. And just like that, everything changed. The adoption agency, now relieved of the financial burden attached to Emma's case, quickly found a family willing to meet her. A couple, kind, warm, willing to love her the way she deserved. Emma was hesitant at first. She had been let down before. But when they walked into her hospital room, smiling gently, holding out a stuffed animal with her name stitched into it, something inside her softened. And for the first time since losing her parents, she let herself hope. The night before she left the hospital, Emma sat at a small desk, a pen shaking slightly in her hand. She stared at the blank paper in front of her. Then slowly, she started to write. "Dear Bryan, I don't know how to say thank you. You didn't just help me. You didn't just save me. You gave me something I thought I'd never have again. Hope. I promise I'll be strong, just like you said. And I'll always remember what you told me. The world is mine. Love, Emma." She folded the paper carefully, slipping it into an envelope. When Bryan Cranston returned to the hospital the next morning, he found it waiting for him. He read every word, and for the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he had played his most important role yet. Not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as a human being. A person who, in the right moment, at the right time, had the power to change someone's life. And he had, because one little girl who had once believed she had no future, now had the whole world ahead of her. Emma's story is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, kindness can change everything. A simple act, a chance encounter, a moment of compassion, these things have the power to rewrite someone's future. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are so many more powerful stories waiting to be told, and I'd love for you to be part of this journey. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.